Of July the 28th, 2020. Let's start with the national anthem and
We would like to acknowledge
that we are here today
on the traditional territory
of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation.
Nous tenons à reconnaître que
nous sommes sur le territoire traditionnel
des Mississaugas de la Première Nation de Credit.
Oh, Canada.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us virtually. Just some preliminary remarks from me as the chair this evening. My name is Bruce Rodriguez, and I am currently serving as the supervisor of the Peel District School Board. I also want you to know that I have spoken with the trustees and have the full support of the board as we move forward together. As you may also know, Colleen Russell Rollins has been appointed the Interim Director of Education and will be starting her role on August the 5th, 2020. We welcome Colleen, and we will have an opportunity at our next meeting to do so more formally. I would like to publicly acknowledge and extend my most sincere gratitude to Mr. Jespal Gill, who has served as the temporary interim director and was gracious in accepting the task and has done an outstanding job over the past weeks in supporting our work. Thank you, Jespal. I would also like to note that the elected trustees of the board are not in their usual seats this evening, and the meeting will be conducted with myself in the chair. It may seem a little strange as I present motions and singularly approve them as well. However, I believe we need to be transparent and do this work publicly. One of the main pieces this evening that will be in front of you will be the budget, and you need to know that the trustees have seen the budget and have had an opportunity to weigh in with questions that have been passed along to me, and I will facilitate as part of the budget budget discussion. So moving on to the budget, which is item number 2 on our agenda. Let me just say a few words of introduction, and then I'll pass it over to staff in order to present the budget this evening. As you know from our agenda, we're here to present and approve the Peel District School Board's 2021 school year budget tonight. This year's proposed balanced budget totals $1,964,273,031. This budget supports the Peel District School Board's commitment to student achievement, anti-Black African Caribbean racism, anti-Islamophobia, equity, anti-oppression, and well-being initiatives as identified in its strategic plan, the Plan for Student Success. This year, the board experienced minimal enrollment growth and minimal changes to the grant for student needs, other than increased funding for centrally negotiated labor commitments. This has translated to an increase in revenues from $1.93 billion to $1.97 billion. In order to address cost pressures and other priorities, the board has once again implemented 10% reductions on all discretionary spend outside of the classrooms. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2020-2021 budget was developed through a modified consultation process that included input from employee group leaders, school administrators, the senior leadership team, and trustees. The board also sought input from staff, parents and guardians, school council members, students and community members through an online survey. As in prior years, the board's budget process included a business case review that allows the board to respond to new and emerging system and school priorities. As part of budget development, priority was placed on maintaining frontline staff and supporting the Peel Board's most vulnerable students. Guided by the consultation processes and ministry directives, the 2020-21 budget is able to support the following ongoing and one-time enhancements. Adding 125 classroom teachers, adding 95 educational assistants and 31 long-term occasional educational assistants to support students with special needs. The provision of feminine hygiene products for secondary schools, and support for culturally responsive and management training for staff. The budget also supports the following, which are related to Ministry of Education directives following the review of the Peel District School Board: employment system review, human resource centralized applicant tracking, a special assistant to the Director of Education, Governance and Board Services, and an outreach officer in the board's new equity office. With an operating budget that is focused on meeting program delivery, staff are asking for approval of an additional $5.48 million from reserves to support one-time business cases that primarily support students with special needs and transportation cost increases. The board's student-focused budget for 2020-2021 demonstrates fiscal responsibility by ensuring funds directly support the great work of staff to make a positive difference in the lives of all Peel Board students. I now welcome Interim Director of Education Jaspal Gill to present the proposed 2020-2021 school year budget for the Peel District School Board. Mr. Gill.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. Before I start with my presentation, I want to acknowledge the commitment and leadership of the senior team to develop this proposed budget. I would also like to thank our finance staff for their outstanding work over the last 4 months in the development of this budget. For school boards, enrollment is a key driver for staffing, determining accommodation needs, and most of the ministry funding is based on student enrollment, normally referred to as average daily enrollment, or ADE. The graph shows that over the last 12 years, our board has experienced enrollment growth except in 2015-16 school year. The huge jump in enrollment in 2014-15 year is due to the fact that all full-day kindergarten students were included in ADE calculations as full-time students and were fully funded as part of the grants for student needs funding. For 2020-21 school year, enrollment projections indicate that the elementary panel will see a growth of 124 students, and the secondary panel growth of 496 students. Overall, our system will see a growth of 620 students, which represents a 0.4% rate of growth. Each year, Ministry introduces changes to the funding it provides to school boards. So some of the specific changes being implemented for next year include the overall grants for student funding is projected to be $25.52 billion. This is provincially, so which is an increase of $250 per pupil funding provincially. So the main changes for 2021, 1% salary increase and benefit funding to reflect the central labor agreements. For grades 9 to 12, funded average class size will change from 28 to 23. For eligible boards, Ministry will continue to provide job protection funds for classroom teachers. There will be an additional funding of 49 cents per pupil amount for educational software licensing. The Ministry will increase the supply teacher benchmark by 1 additional day to recognize sick leave usage. The 2020-21 funding will include student support funds for additional staff to support the local learning needs of students. All of these funds need to be used consistent with the central agreement obligations. To streamline funding, some of the existing allocations will now be transferred into the GSN starting in 2020-21 year. The Ministry has launched a review of student transportation funding formula. While the review is underway, funding will be at the 2019-20 level with adjustments for enrollment growth. There will be a 2% increase to the non-staff portion of school operations allocation to assist school boards in managing the increase in commodity prices such as hydro, natural gas, and so on. Ministry will also continue with the implementation of multi-year changes it introduced in previous years. Benefit benchmarks will be further reduced due to the phase out of the retirement gratuities. Ministry will continue with the phase-in of campus definition for calculating the school foundation grant. 2020-21 will be the last year of the phase-in. In regards to capital investments, Ministry will continue to provide additional facilities renewal funding as part of the school condition improvement grant. Our board's share next year will be $52.6 million. In addition, the board will also receive $21.9 million in annual school renewal allocation next year. So based on the consultation with trustees, senior administration, and the input received from various unions, federations, school councils, and the public, staff has developed a proposed balanced budget. This slide or the next few slides, in fact, highlight some of the enhancements included in this proposed budget. Additional 125 classroom teachers, including teachers for new special education classes. Additional teaching assistant to support students with special needs, 95 permanent and 31 long-term occasionals. Additional 5 staff to support schools with students with autism spectrum disorder by providing information, assessments, equipment, and assessing resources. A team of 4 behavior analysts to support highest need students to ensure that these students are able to attend school and access education. An occupational therapist for coordination with community occupational therapists, physiotherapists, as well as to support special education programs and services. An ESL ELD coordinator to support the implementation of ESL ELD policies and guidelines. An outreach officer to rebuild and maintain trust and credibility with the community, particularly with our Black communities. 2 graduation coaches to provide intensive, culturally responsive support to Black students to improve their academic achievement and well-being. Additional 9.7 custodial staff to support school facilities, including our new private Bookamsing Public School in Brampton. Assistant to the Director of Education to provide governance, advisory services, and support to the board for effective, respectful, and transparent governance. Funding to retain an independent expert to conduct a comprehensive employment systems review. Funding to establish a centralized applicant tracking and file management system for all hiring, promotion, and acting appointments. Additional funding for human resources area to support abilities, health and safety, and staff training, including culturally responsive customer training for office staff. A school support officer to implement leadership development programs and develop resources through an anti-oppressive lens to support aspiring leaders and system leaders in all areas of our plan for student success. Additional funding to conduct mandatory annual inspections to ensure our facilities continue to be safe for staff and students. Funding to support the supply of feminine hygiene products to students to create a more equitable and supportive learning environment. Additional funding to cover student transportation cost increases due to increase in service contracts, additional students, change of split between boards and holding schools. And funding to support Peel Learning Foundation to cover staffing costs and a portion of their operating cost as it moves to fully sustainability. I also wanted to highlight some of the potential risks for 2020-21. Enrollment decline due to COVID-19. As you know, we are a growth board. Our enrollment depends upon new families moving into this region from outside the country, as well as other parts of Ontario or Canada. Since March this year, there is no immigration, and very few families are moving. So this would have an impact on our enrollment. Also, there would be less fee-paying international students in Peel. There is also possibility of some families, their reluctance to send their children to school. So all of these things could have an impact on our enrollment projections come September. And because our funding is based on the enrollment, so that could impact the funding that we will receive next year. Also, depending upon the school reopening plans, there will be additional costs due to PPE requirements, hand sanitizing stations, enhanced cleaning, student transportation, staff absence coverage, and other associated costs. There is a possibility that all of these costs may not be fully covered by the ministry. There will also be additional costs, such as for technology, for remote learning, and that may not also be fully covered by the ministry. Wanting to highlight these risks as we move into the 2020 school year. Our board, along with many other boards in the province, continue to experience a funding shortfall in the area of special education. This slide shows you the funding gap for the last 5 years. In 2021, the funding gap is projected to increase to approximately 19 million as the need for special education students continue to grow within our board. If we look at our operating expenditures by area, over 81% are directly related to school expenditures. 3.8% are related to central sports for schools, 8.1% related to facilities, 3.1% related to student transportation, and 3.7% related to administration. Now if we look at operating expenditures by type of expenditure, over 83% of the expenditures are related to staff salaries and benefit costs. 10.6% are related to non-staffing costs. 1.5% related to interest charges on long-term capital debt that we have in order for us to build new schools in addition to our existing facilities. And 4.2% related to amortization of capital assets. So looking further into staffing costs, approximately 68% are related to teachers, 10.8% to teaching assistants and early childhood educators, 4.4% to school administration including principals and vice principals, 2.5% related to school office support staff, 2.8% to PSSP staff, 6.2% related to our custodial and maintenance trade staff, and 0.9% to continuing education staff, and 4.2% related to our trustees, board administration, directors, superintendent, and transportation staff. Looking further into non-staffing costs, 2.7% of the costs are related to student transportation. We operate along with Dufferin Peel. We have a joint transportation, and we have around 1,400 buses any given day in the morning and in the afternoon on the road. 1.4% to facilities maintenance, another 1.4% related to school supplies, approximately 0.5% related to technology, 1.5% to utilities, and 0.6% related to administration, and 1.7% of the costs are related to school-generated funds. So if we look at large urban boards and compare per pupil funding, our board will receive $10,252 next year. Just wanted to provide you that with that information. So thank you, Chair, and I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. I do have some questions related to the budget, and certainly trustees have been part of providing some input into the questions as well. So I have a number of them. Let me first just begin by thanking you and the staff for the great work that you've done and the presentation. You've certainly made it easy for us to understand based on some of the difficulties sometimes that the ministry might present in providing some of these numbers. So thank you to you and the staff. The first question that I have relates to the equity department that we have been instructed to set up as a result of the ministry directives. It does not seem to be listed under the budget summary of expenses. It appears that going forward the role will be more permanent, as it is essential for serving the diverse communities at the PDSB. Is there a reason that this is not treated like the other departments? For example, the SO of Equity and all the staff of the department are not listed, and the associated costs like salary, benefits, staff development, etc., don't appear to be listed as well, or am I missing something?
So again, through you, Chair, I will answer that question. In terms of the equity department, it absolutely will be permanent for the 2020-2021 school year. At this point, the equity department has not been formed. This department will be formed as of August the 4th. And at this point, the costs associated with that department, which includes staff, which includes benefits, which includes professional learning, are across different departments. So for example, workplace equity will become a part of this particular equity department, equity office. Workplace equity currently exists in human resources. So if you go into the budget book that we've provided, you will see the workplace equity roles are sitting there. So you have the manager of workplace equity, along with the workplace equity partner and the assistant that's attached. Another example would be the principal of Indigenous education and equity, along with the instructional coordinators for Indigenous education, We Rise Together, and a number of equity resource teachers. It is evident that they are in the curriculum budget at this point, and again, they will be pulled into a central equity department. And then finally, the third piece, which I think is important, is the connection around community. Currently, there are 4 community outreach workers which are sitting in our early years and social emotional learning department, and there's 1 additional staff member that's currently sitting in the director's office budget. Those will be pulled into the department. Our hope is that revised estimates in the fall, we will be bringing that department together and pulling the funds for those departments from the other departments into a central department called Indigenous Education, Anti-Racism, Anti-Oppression, and Community Partnerships. So they are in the budget. It's just about pulling those folks out, pulling the professional learning costs out, and creating the department itself on paper.
Thank you, appreciate that, A.D. Grewal. My next question is about what is the additional estimated startup costs associated with COVID-19 for the 2021 school year? There is some clarity about the investment for mental health supports and technology-related costs, but is the board receiving funding to cover the costs of purchasing PPE, costs for hand sanitizing stations, increased custodial costs, increase in transportation costs, cost to modify furniture if necessary, and any other anticipated costs? And where will the funds come from to cover such expenses? If the ministry is not covering the cost for this, can we have some confidence that the monies used to cover these costs will not adversely affect the students in the classroom?
Through you, Chair, we have an understanding that there will be a minister's announcement later this week regarding the reopening plans. After this announcement, and after receiving further clarification from the ministry regarding PPE or any other requirements, staff will work towards establishing the costs. Ministry has not provided any funding at this time, any additional funding at this time. However, they have indicated that they are aware that the school boards cannot pay for these costs, additional costs from their budgets. So the hope is that the ministry will cover these costs. But I can assure you, Mr. Chair, that any of these costs will not adversely affect the students in the classroom.
Thank you, Mr. Gill, appreciate that. Last year when the business cases were presented to the trustees, they seem to have approved the funding of an additional human rights employee, but the position was created nonetheless. Sorry, they did not approve, I should say. Let me clarify again. They did not approve the funding of an additional human rights employee, but the position was created nonetheless. It appears that this position is being carried forward for another year, or does the term hired 1920 mean that it's a contract position that will end in 2020? And how were funds directed to this position? And if it was not approved, why was it carried forward? Is this intended to be a permanent position?
Yeah, Through your chair, it is a permanent position currently in that area. So based on the workload of the staff in that area, they have indicated the need for this position. So last year, or this current year, this position was paid from in-year savings. And going forward, it is part of the operating budget.
Thank you. So for clarity, it is a permanent position as a follow-up question, Mr. Gill?
It is a permanent position currently, yes.
Thank you. Also seeking some clarity, if the Peel District School Board were originally hiring 4 graduation coaches, only 2 are listed in the budget, and especially on one of the slides that you presented, and there is no indication that these positions are funded by the ministry. In comparison, when reference is being made to the Human Rights Commissioner and the Human Rights Officer, it is noted that these positions are grant funded. Why are there only 2 graduation coaches listed, and why don't they appear as grant funded?
So again, through you, Chair, for the 2020-2021 school year, we will have 4 graduation coaches. 2 of them are being funded through the board budget, which is what you would see on page 82 in the Curriculum and Instruction Support Services Department. There are 2 additional graduation coach positions that are being funded through grants from the ministry, the Priorities and Partnerships Fund. We know at this point that we will be receiving those funds. We have not received them, and that's why they are not showing up within the budget, because those are ongoing fundings that come throughout the year. So there will be 4 graduation coaches. There was a decision made that we will go with the 2 that the ministry is funding, and then additionally, we've added 2 more for the 2020-21 school year.
Appreciate that. Just to follow up, AD Gruel, if in fact the priorities fund that is provided by the ministry is greater than what you anticipate, will the excess or the delta of that go to funding the 3rd coach, or is that scheduled to be placed somewhere else?
Yes, it would fund the 3rd coach, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
You've identified the issue of feminine hygiene products, and it has been raised at the board table in the past. It seems that when it was raised in the past, the response included an startup estimate of about $82,000 and also additional budget costs. Could you please explain to us what those additional costs refer to? And in order to cover these costs, are we looking at the board budget as you've presented it? It's already in the budget, or as we move forward, and I'm thinking about in perpetuity, will this be a sense of always being in the budget, or are we going to look to reserves to fund it?
Through you, Chair, there is a one-time cost and an ongoing cost, as you've indicated, associated with this initiative. So for for the next year's budget, the one-time costs are being covered through the reserve funds, but the ongoing costs are covered or included in our regular operating budget. So going forward, the plan is to include all costs, because there will not be any one-time cost, because that is for the installation of the it's not devices, it's where where they are located in the washrooms. So that's a one-time cost, but going forward, the ongoing cost will be covered through our operating costs.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. Just a general question about going forward, would it be possible to separate the costs of furniture and equipment in different lines so as to reassure the public that we utilize furniture that we already have in storage and we aren't using, acquiring new pieces? It would be helpful to see the furniture costs kept to a minimum, and at times it appears that we have high recurring furniture expenses. For example, the budget has furniture and equipment rentals at almost $300,000, it would be great if we could differentiate what equipment we are buying and or renting versus the furniture that we are buying or renting.
Yeah, through you, Chair, I can assure you that every time there is a need identified for an additional furniture, we always look at our warehouse to see what we have, and we will definitely use that first before we go out and purchase new one. But having said that, on page 225, the cost on that page is actually related to the leasing cost and maintenance costs contracts for our duplicating machines, not related to any furniture. But I agree, going forward, we will do our best to separate the furniture and equipment costs. So it's clear what is related to furniture and what's related to other type of equipment.
Appreciate that, Mr. Gill. And just to also add to that as a follow-up, where it has been distinguished that it does relate to the cost of the copiers, I'm going to be asking another question around the separation piece as well. So I think that might be helpful as part of the explanation as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you. In the budget, reference is also made to homeschooling wages and support for program development. Was there a sense that we were attempting to eliminate this term as it may confuse the community, since homeschooling could be interpreted as something else? There is also reference in the budget to home instruction teaching assistant. This appears to be a clear description of the service being provided. Is it possible to eliminate the use of the term homeschooling, or does it refer to something else and needs to be present?
So again, through you, Chair, I think a couple of comments. First around what we mean by homeschooling versus home instruction. So the homeschooling wages fall under the Curriculum and Instruction Department. These are for students whose families have decided to homeschool them. And really the salaries and wages there are to process the paperwork so that we know what students are engaged and their families are engaged in homeschooling. So that's what sits in curriculum and instruction. So little different to what you see in special education around home instruction teaching assistants. The home instruction teaching assistants serve some of our most vulnerable students due to either health issues, physical or mental health, as well as students who we might need to engage in some exclusion from school due to some high needs at the school level. So the home instruction teaching assistants are supporting those students at home. Mostly students with special education needs that require the support. We're homeschooling our families who've made the decision to homeschool their students. So really, when you look at the difference, the homeschooling really is more of a paperwork piece to track who these students are so we don't lose sight of them. And then the home instruction is actually providing support to students directly.
Thank you for the clarity. Can I assume that when families decide to homeschool their son or daughter, that would be up to them to take care of, and we're simply sort of doing the paperwork of them informing us, and so that budget is relatively small in comparison?
That would be correct.
Thank you. When the Peel Learning Foundation began, the PDSB trustees were in favor of supporting the foundation for 1 year, but it appears that we have been doing this for the entire 3-year contract. We're now about to extend the Peel Learning Foundation director position for another year. Are there plans to review the feasibility and sustainability of the foundation and rethink how we can best support vulnerable students and maximize the benefits and minimize administrative costs?
Yes. Through you, Chair, the business case at that time was approved for a 3-year funding. So the budget that is in front of you today does include funding support for 1 more additional year. And I think staff agrees that we need to review the feasibility and sustainability of the foundation in this coming year.
So can I assume then that this will be brought back to the table after the review for next year's budget without it being included?
Yes, I can confirm that. Yes, that will be the case.
Great, thank you. Under the IT department, you have identified $1.4 million as rental fees. This is going back to the piece that you just spoke about regarding the photocopiers. In the notes, it's explained as internet or Wi-Fi costs, so to speak. If it truly is that, can we just call it that? It seems that leaving it as rental does not capture the essence of what the amount is used for.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, for sure. Let me confirm first that these are in fact internet and Wi-Fi related costs. And we will make sure that that is correct on going forward in the budget book.
Thank you, that's very helpful. I liked your slide 9 where you spoke about the funding for special education and the gap. How do special education costs affect the budget year over year, which is what you were trying to present to us? Would you say funding from the ministry is helping to close the gap in terms of support for special needs students? When I look at that, it almost seems like it's getting to the point of being exponential to a certain degree. And what is being done, or do we have a sense of, I know that SEAC and other organizations do advocate in this, in this respect, but if we keep kind of funding that gap, do we have a plan, or do we know what the ministry intends to do as we move forward to close that gap more effectively?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as indicated in my presentation and on this slide, so if we look at the last 5 years, yes, the funding gap between the funding that we receive from the ministry as well, when we compare that to our expenditures, in fact, for next year, the funding gap is almost $19 million. And over the last 5 years, that funding gap has increased from $8 million to $19 million. And Peel is actually is known for the services that it provides to the special education students. And we have always have written to many times to the ministry indicating to them our concerns that regarding the funding that our board receives related to the services that we provide to our special education students. And we will continue to do that. We will continue to meet with ministry staff. We will continue to identify to them our cost. And the hope is that going forward that the ministry will look at the funding that it provides to the school boards and make some adjustments so that we can reduce the gap that we have in our expenditures as well as in the funding that we see.
As a follow-up, Mr. Gilgard, do we have a sense of the percentage of students in the Peel board that require special needs assistance in comparison to the province? And I know that that's a question that you might not have on hand, but perhaps that's something that we might need to have brought back just to kind of get a feel for how we service students and why the gap continues to kind of grow. Might be very helpful so that we have. So I'm simply looking for a comparison between what the percentage of students identified with special needs in the board relative to those identified in the province.
So again, through you, Chair, we'll need to get back to you on the exact numbers. However, I will point out that we have students who are identified with special education needs and we have students who are non-identified. So I think to get a sense of that, we'll need to bring that back to the board.
Would that be possible to see next time we meet? Great. If the recording secretary could place that down as a pending item for us, really appreciate that. Were there any funds set aside for the protection and safety of students with special needs as we return to school in September? I know that you've already spoken a little bit to that. I'm just wondering if those students were taken into consideration as part of the big picture.
Mr. Chair, actually, I'm going to ask Associate Director Mark Harmon to speak to that.
Thank you. So through you, Chair, at the current time, we don't have any funding set aside for that purpose. We are waiting for the ministry to confirm what it is that they will and will not pay for. However, in our current draft operating procedure, our special education table has taken into account the needs of special education students. We have clauses in place around Peel Public Health consultation for medically fragile students, etc. And we'll certainly ensure that any and all required PPE is in place, as well as any additional staffing, etc., going forward. So I guess right now, we're in a bit of a holding pattern to wait and see what will be funded by the ministry, what won't. We also need to see exactly what it is that the ministry will require of us in terms of our plan going forward. And we will also, of course, await approval of our draft operating procedures, but we certainly do have plans in place to support our spec ed students going forward. That will definitely be part of our plan. What it is that the funding looks like will either come from ministry grants and or out of our normal operating procedures. But again, it is in our plan, it's being taken into consideration. It is now just a question of awaiting what it is the plans will exactly look like and what it is that will be funded or not, but we will of course be ensuring the safety of our spec ed students going forward.
Appreciate the response, AD Harmon. Just flagging it for staff, just so that you recognize that if in fact there is a gap in the special education funding already, that more money isn't taken out of that gap in order to fund this particular situation as well. That if the ministry doesn't provide, we might need to find funds so that we don't increase the gap that is necessary for their education around this particular situation.
Through you, Chair, thank you. A point well taken. And certainly we do have some preliminary funding worked out through our table teams. So we do have some numbers in terms of what it will cost going forward. And I know that myself and Associate Director Grail have had some preliminary conversations about how it is that we might cover those. But thank you very much. It is a point well taken and will be taken into consideration going forward.
Thank you. Next question is about the TAs that will be hired in September. How will they be allocated, and will you be looking at schools in high priority socioeconomic communities first?
Through you, Chair. When we're looking at the allocation of teaching assistants, they're always based on student needs. So every year we engage in a process led by the Special Education Department where schools fill out student independence forms, so we call them SIFs. And as schools fill those out, they fill them out for each student that they believe requires some kind of teaching assistant support. So that will vary from school to school. It will vary from student to student because it is based on need. In terms of our goal, when we're looking at kind of the whole independence piece for students, we're moving them through a continuum. So a student could have, for example, a 0.5 teaching assistant allocated 1 year, but as they've moved towards independence, they might have, the allocation might be less because they require less of that support. So it is never based on socioeconomic in terms of schools. Teaching assistant allocation is solely based on student need, and it is facilitated through the Special Education Department, working very closely with school principals and in-school support teams, as well as PSSP staff.
Appreciate that. And A.D. Grewal, could you let us know if in fact that changes during the year, if the needs change? So is it an in-year change that can occur, or is it a set amount that starts off the year, and as needs change, we need to wait for the next year?
So again, through you, Chair, there has been times in the last few years where we have come back to the board to ask for more teaching assistants based on student needs. And what we find every year around September, October, as enrollment kind of settles down, we actually end up having more need within the board, and we've often come back here to ask for more teaching assistants if that is the case.
Appreciate that. Next question is, where in the budget line are legal fees and costs associated with settling any human rights cases or other lawsuits listed? Going forward, can these be separated so the public and community can get a better understanding of the legal costs that we incur as a board?
Through you, Chair, these costs are part of the central organizational expenses, page 51 in the budget book, and the legal fees are identified separately. However, to reduce legal expenses and for better accountability, we will be reviewing the feasibility of in-house legal counsel as recommended as part of the ministry review.
Thank you, appreciate that. I'm sure we'll come back to that as the year kind of progresses as well. Thank you, by the way, for the announcement today around the SRO program. Are there any costs associated with having the SRO program in our schools? And if yes, can that be found in the budget, or is that completely funded by the PRP?
Through you, Chair, I can assure you that the board is not responsible for any cost related to the SRO program. All the costs are paid by the Peel Regional Police.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. And just finally, in terms of one question, this is more sort of an all-encompassing question that might have different sort of tentacles to it. Could someone say on staff or a couple of people on staff speak to examples in the budget where we would be delivering on anti-Black African Caribbean racism, anti-Islamophobia, anti-oppression and equity? I'm thinking specifically around students and items like de-streaming as one example. And are there other things, because obviously we don't have a line item in there, but we are required to attend to all of that. Are there examples that might be present, and how would one kind of find that we've provided some monies in the budget to address these particular issues? I speak again about things like de-streaming, grad rates, suspension situations, so on and so forth.
Through you, Chair, I'll start, and then if Associate Director Harmon wants to add some examples from the Safe Schools perspective. So first of all, when we're looking at the budget, we have an additional equity resource teacher, for example, in curriculum and instruction. And that particular resource teacher was added to look at student well-being from a Muslim student perspective and looking at Islamophobia in particular. So that particular case right now, a budget case, is sitting with curriculum and instruction, and it will eventually be moving into our newly formed equity department. So that would be an example of where we're looking at kind of an anti-oppression, discrimination, and looking at elimination of that. The other additional support that we have, which was also came through the ministry directives, there's a budget case for a community outreach worker, which is currently sitting in the director's office budget, which will also be moved to the equity office. And really the purpose of that particular position is to look at is really looking at building relationships and partnerships with our diverse community. And in that particular case, it will be around our Black African and Caribbean Black communities. So those would be some examples. Specifically around de-streaming and grad rates, etc. As you would know, we currently have budget in our curriculum and instruction department, as well as our student success alternative programs department. And what we'll need to look at is when we're looking at implementing the ministry directives, we need to see that as our work every day and not as something that's an add-on. So when we're looking at professional learning, for example, for our grade 7 to 10 teachers, and we're looking at de-streaming grade 9 math is one of the examples the ministry has put forward, we need to look at our professional learning through that lens of how we're gonna look at assessment practices, curriculum mapping, instructional strategies, so that teachers, educators are ready to be able to look at de-streaming for September 2021. So I think what it's going to do is it's going to allow us, the ministry directives have allowed us to really look at the current funds we do have for professional learning and start to really focus on making sure that we're meeting the needs of all students. And in the case of de-streaming, we're looking at Black students in particular. And that would be a structural barrier that currently exists for students that we have seen in the findings of the ministry review, as well as lots of other documented research. So those would be some of those examples. I'll pass it on to Associate Director Harmon to perhaps talk about in the budget our work around safe schools, which will also get to some of those pieces around discipline and in particular anti-Black racism.
Good, thank you for that, Associate Director Graywell. I'm going to apologize. I have a little bit of an internet chop up here in Caledon. So if my voice kind of drifts in and out and sounds a little bit odd, I apologize for that. the joys of living in the country. So yeah, absolutely. The business case that has just been approved for 2 additional safe and accepting schools resource teachers will assist the work around Directive 21 and 22 that is currently underway through Superintendent Demare. In particular, there's work being done to reframe our restorative practices work through an anti-Black racism lens as well as an anti-oppression lens. In addition to that, our progressive discipline policies, Policy 48, and the particular operating procedures that relate to that are also being rewritten through those same lenses. So that work will be completed. That policy, along with those programs, will be coming forward to a future board meeting. And of course, the business cases for those 2 safe and accepting schools resource teachers will support us in moving forward and implementing that in our schools going forward. So that's an example from our safe and accepting school side.
Thanks to both A.D. Grewal and A.D. Harmon for that. Just to let you know, certainly, you know, as we look at the budget and look at the amount of money that we spend on various items, that going forward, that we as a board will certainly be looking for that lens to be applied to the work that comes forward at this board on a regular basis. So whatever the reports are that we're requesting or that return to us, that needs to be part of the overall lens. And if budget is required to provide for that, then I think that we need to be prepared to put some of that budget in that particular area or domain. But I think that we will certainly be paying attention to it as well, because we do want to kind of make sure that we have results and advance the agenda. So appreciate that and thank you for that. So that completes all of the questions that I have. Thank you again for your concise responses. We are now going to put forward the budget motions. And are we going to have them up on the screen, or am I reading them out here? Give me a second. Director Gill, do you have them? Just lost them here. Great, thank you. So there are 4 motions to be put on the floor. The first one is that the total consolidated operating expense budget for 2020-2021 of $1,964,273,031 be approved. So that's the first motion. I'm going to break up each of these particular motions just in case there are questions in between as we work through them. So that's the motion on the floor, and I will approve that motion, and we will say yes to that. The second motion on the floor is that the total capital budget for 2021 of $67,333,068 be approved. So that motion is on the floor. Just some discussion to ensue very briefly, if that's okay, Mr. Gill. So in terms of the capital budget, just a couple of questions around the capital budget. I know that we had a new school bill that just started, I believe, or is ongoing perhaps. Are there any foreseeable new bills coming up as part of that capital budget, or any accommodation reviews that we anticipate coming up as part of this capital budget?
Through you, Chair, in regards to any consolidation reviews, there's nothing coming for next year. But in regards to the new schools, the ministry has actually has approved two new schools for our board, and one is in Mississauga on Elm Drive Public School. That's just under construction now. And the other one is Malala Yousaf Public School in Brampton that we are waiting for final approval from the ministry and will be hoping to have under construction in the fall.
So the 67 million here primarily deals with those issues of sustainability within schools currently?
Yes, and some of the expenditures that may happen next year as part of these new bills, as well as mostly the sustainability of existing buildings, yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions and approve the second motion. The third motion, that in order to balance the 2021 operating budget, the transfer of $1,581,835 from board-approved appropriated reserves be approved. And the second one, I'm going to do 3 and 4 together. And 4 is that $5,476,030 from the uncommitted working fund reserve be approved to support long-term occasional teaching assistance, one-time ministry directive expenditures, student transportation, and other board priorities that are one-time in nature. So in the first case, in terms of the use of the 1.5 million, the transfer from board-approved appropriate reserves be approved. In that particular situation, do we have a sense of what that money is being appropriated to, the 1.5, or are we looking at the total of 6 million being part of the overall budget?
Through you, Mr. Chair, of course, we are looking at the overall total part of this year's budget. What we have identified that the item number 3 or the motion number 3 is based on what the board has already approved in the past years, and whereas the motion 4 is related to the items that are being approved into this year's or the next year's budget, or the budget which is in front of us.
Thank you. Appreciate the clarification in terms of where the funding is coming from. I think that's good for public accountability. So when we look at the other piece, which is the 5 million, and we speak about those one-time expenditures, those one-time expenditures, are we suggesting that they would not be ongoing, that it is only for this year? And if they were to be ongoing, that they would be funded within the budget for upcoming years?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I can confirm that most of these expenditures are one-time items that will be for next year. But having said that one area which is the student transportation, there's a $3 million which is ongoing cost. And as I mentioned as part of my presentation, that Ministry has undertaken a review of the funding formula for student transportation. And their plan is to have that review completed next school year, and the results of the review then implemented for the following year. So we really strongly feel that we will receive additional funding from the ministry as part of that review, and that we will have that $3 million as part of the funding that moving forward from the ministry grant, and that will be paid from that grant. That's the plan.
Thank you. Mr. Gu, could you tell us what the approximately what the reserve is left over after the use of these reserves, one from the approved appropriated reserves, and then secondly from the uncommitted working fund reserve?
I believe once these funds are once these funds are approved, the use of these funds are approved for these items, I believe we will have reserves of just over probably $40 million still left with the board.
And would you, in your expert opinion, would you say that that's a healthy reserve in terms of moving forward, that removing this 6 million would not put us in any jeopardy?
Through you, Chair, we strongly feel that we are in a good, healthy position as far as our reserves go, and that is a good, healthy leftover reserve funds that we will have after this, the use of these expenditures. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. I will approve the motions, those last two motions. So that's motion 3 and 4 that's also been approved. That will take us to our next. Thank you for those motions, by the way. Will take us to our next item on the agenda, which is new business. And I'm at 3.1, which is ministry review directives. These are essentially here, both 3.1A and 3.1B are both here as receipt. The governance expert has provided her reports as prescribed by Directive 5 of the ministry directives, and we are in receipt of the reports and will give it due consideration. We also want to assure that we will have placed an anti-Black, African Caribbean, anti-oppression, anti-Islamophobia, and anti-equity lens on the work as we move forward, and the reports will also be forwarded to the ministry as required by the directive. So we are in receipt of that and will do as I've just stated. Item 3.1C, which is Directive 10, deals with the Superintendent of Equity, and I would like to ask, through the Director, to ask staff for an oral report on where we are regarding the Superintendent of Equity.
Thank you, Chair. So through you, Chair, I'm going to give a brief oral report around Directive 10, which is the hiring of the Superintendent of Equity position. In Directive 10 of the Ministry Directions to the Peel District School Board, it was directed that the Board shall establish a new robust equity office managed by a Superintendent of Equity. The Board, furthermore, shall ensure that a Superintendent of Equity is hired both through an internal and an external posted position. And this individual would be accountable to the Equity Office and the implementation of the annual Equity Action Plan, and shall report to the Associate Director responsible for equity. The Superintendent of Equity role was posted twice under the name Superintendent of Equity and Community Services. These posting dates were as follows. The first posting opened on May 7th and closed on May 19th, all of this year. The second posting opened June 2nd and closed on June 15th of this year. These two particular postings in May and June did not elicit qualified candidates for this role. However, in early July 2020, we co-created the Superintendent of Equity posting by consulting with a number of individuals, including equity colleagues in York and Toronto. We also consulted Ministry of Education staff, both in their equity department as well as Indigenous education. We talked to internal and external equity and anti-oppression experts, given the focus of this role. And we also consulted with members of Peel's Black Community Advisory, in particular members of the We Rise Together Community Advisory Council, given the ministry review and the directions connected around concerns of systemic anti-Black racism. The new role that was created, we called the Superintendent of Indigenous Education, Anti-Racism, Anti-Oppression, and Community Partnerships. And that particular role was posted on Wednesday, July 8th, and it closed Thursday, July 23rd. The position was posted in a number of areas, and I'll just highlight a couple. It was posted through Applied Education, which is the digital platform that we use to post such jobs. It was posted at Code, OPSOA. We also posted with the Ontario Alliance of Black Student Educators, along with various social media platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And we also directly emailed the posting to a number of community agencies, including United Way, the Regional Diversity Roundtable as a couple of examples, along with local newspapers. So that would be the Mississauga News, Brampton Guardian, and the Caledon Enterprise. Because the posting has closed on July 23rd, we are currently in the process of reviewing the applications. Interim Director Colleen Russell-Rawlings will be involved in this hiring process and is already engaged with us as Associate Directors to hire for this position. Our hope is to have the Superintendent of Indigenous Education, Anti-Racism, Anti-Oppression, and Community Partnerships in place for September 1st.
Thank you for that oral report, Edie Grewal, and it is my pleasure to have received it as well, so thank you. We are also looking at 3.2, which is the third quarterly financial report. Is there anything that needs to be highlighted in that particular report? It is also here for receipt. I just want to highlight one piece that was brought certainly to my attention, was around page 43 of the agenda, where we have the central organizational expenses and the percent of budget incurred, the movement of minus 88.9% in 1920 as opposed to 40.4% in 1819. So a lot of good work has been done and lots of explanation as to how that occurred. So just a thanks to the controller, Alachi Charles, and the entire finance department for the detail in explaining the apparent huge discrepancy, as well as for their ongoing dedicated hard work in helping us and trustees understand, and the public to understand this important report. So thank you for that. Mr. Gill, if there's anything specific that you want to highlight prior to receipt, please feel free. Otherwise, we will move to receipt.
Yeah, through you, Chair, no, nothing to identify. I think based on the overall expenditures, again, we are in a good position, and there's nothing that I think I need to identify at this point to bring to your attention for any concerns.
Great, thank you. So we will receive that report as well this evening. And then moving on to 3.3, which is the school year calendar. It is also here for receipt. Don't know if staff wants to highlight anything about the school year calendar.
So I'll ask Associate Director Mark Harmon to see if he wants to highlight anything.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Chair. The change that we've made to the school year calendar is the addition of a third professional learning day prior to the start of the school year. That would be September 1st. This came under, or from ministry recommendation, around preparing for reopening of schools around the COVID-19 pandemic. What we have done is we have taken a professional learning day, February 12th, I believe it is, or early February. We have moved that now to September 1st, so there will be 3 professional learning days, September 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, before students begin school the day after Labor Day. And again, those 3 days will be utilized for a variety of purposes. Part of it is, of course, preparing our schools and staff for the return of schools, for the reopening of schools, the return of students, following the pandemic and the closure in the spring. There will also be some health and safety training, and there will also be some directive-related anti-Black racism training. So those 3 days will be utilized for that, and that is basically the only change in the school year calendar. It is here, of course, now to move forward in alignment with a ministry request.
Thank you, Edie Harmon, and we will receive the school year calendar for 2020-2021. 3.4 on the agenda is the resolution re-signing officers. The only reason that that's in front of us this evening is because there has been a change in the signing officers based on the changes that have occurred in senior administration, and that is also for receipt, and we will receive that as well as the changes have been designated on the report. Item number 4, which is items for receipt. And in here we have 4.1, which is the retirements. And we have them for receipt, given the, just trying to get to the page where I have the retirements. Here we go. Given the amount of time these folks have certainly spent with the system, I think it's only appropriate, A, to thank them for their service, congratulate them on their retirement, but I would also like to call their names out publicly. So please bear with me as we just go through the retirement list, which is something that I certainly think each one of them will deserve. And Joanne Bell, Bruce Cabot, Mina Capitano, Eric Hancock, Antoinette Liebrandt, Andrea Lever, Marcia Loomis, Anna Martone, Lisa Miller-Wood, Corey Montague, Jody Murphy, Karen Phipps, Virginia Rasmussen, Philomena Ribeiro, Mary Smith, and Lorianne Stetson. Enjoy your retirement and thank you for your service. The next one is 4.2, which is the OSSTF District 19 Secondary Teachers Tentative Local Agreement. Again, it is here for receipt. It had been approved earlier by myself in this particular case because it was needed to ratify the agreement, and that agreement has been approved, as well as the OSSTF District 19 Professional Student Services Personnel Tentative Local Agreement was also approved. Once again, huge thank you to all of those involved in ensuring that those would be approved so that we could move on without any labor disruption in the forthcoming year. Number 5, so all of those are considered received, 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3. Number 5, reports from the Ontario Public School Boards Association. Again, these are simply reports that are provided to trustees for their perusal, and I did have an opportunity to go through some of them, and the call for policy resolutions, I'd sort of highlight for you that particular piece on each of those reports is something that you might want to take a look at as trustees as well. So that pretty much brings to, not pretty much, it does bring to an end our agenda this evening. Thank you to all of you that have tuned in to listen to it virtually. Keep safe and enjoy the rest of the evening. And we'll be back here again, I believe, sometime in August. The meeting will be adjourned. Thank you.